Good morning and welcome to Coming to New England. My name is Danielle Rouleau and today we are with my grandmother. Thanks for coming in today.
You're welcome.
All right, let's get started. So for my first question, let's start out with what is your first name, your last name, and your maiden name?
Well, my first name is Eileen. My married name is Duhame. I'm your mom's mom. And my maiden name is Fenner. And I've been doing a lot of research on my family's genealogy. So the first ancestor that I found was Captain Arthur Fenner, who came here from England in 1646. He was a military man. He was a captain in Cromwell's army. So he got to Rhode Island. He married. He had a family. They had 7 children. But he was very, very interested in the politics of the time. So he wore a lot of hats. He was a judge, and he was a governor's assistant. And he also had some secular hats, too. He was a carpenter. He built his house, and he was a surveyor and a farmer and a whole lot of other things. And, of course, he built his own house. It was one of those stone enders. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the stone enders it was a large fireplace that took up one whole end of the north side of the house. So that was really great, you know, for the New England winters that they had then. Major Thomas Fenner was Captain Arthur Fenner's son. And of course he got old enough to marry, and his father built him a house, you know, very close to where his house was. And he built another stone ender for him. And so Thomas lived there with his wife, and it still stands today. It's up in Cranston. It's right off Plainfield Pike. It's the oldest continually occupied home in Rhode Island. And it's also owned once again, you know, within the last 10 years, I think, by a Fenner, a member of the Fenner family. And he's made it into a vacation rental. So although it's been brought up to code, you know, for today's standards, you can still go in there and you can still tour the place, and you see the old wood and the big fire room and the big walk-in fireplace. And it's just a really nice house to visit. Thomas, too, was also involved in the politics of the time. They were having all those King Philip's Wars, you know, the uprisings with the Indians at that time. So, you know, so I guess from what I've read, that Captain Arthur and Major Thomas were close friends and political allies with Roger Williams. And they all got involved in ending those wars. Yeah. So that was kind of a tough time. Fast forward to, well, I guess 4 generations. We had a governor, Arthur Fenner, and he was governor back in the 1790s. And I think he was the first governor that served when Rhode Island was the last of the 13 colonies to ratify the Constitution. But he died in office. And he had a son, James, who was also in politics. And he had been a senator, and he gave up his Senate seat to serve as governor. And he actually served 3 terms as governor back in the 1800s. My father, 8th generation from Captain Arthur. He was born in 1912. He was born in Conimicut, Rhode Island, although his family moved to Providence, and that's where he was raised. He wasn't a politician, but he was a very proud American, and he was in the military. He joined the Navy when he was 17 years old. That was in 1929. And he served 4 years, I believe. And while he was there, he learned how to dive. Diving in those days meant those big heavy suits, you know, with the big heavy metal headpiece that you had to screw in, and the hoses that went down, you know. So he did that, and he learned engineering. And so that's what he did. I believe, too, while he was in the Navy at that time, when he was so young, he was sent to South America for combat. There was some sort of an uprising at that time. So he also got combat training at that time. Well, after his stint in the Navy, you know, of course, he just lived his life, and it got to be 1941, And they met in the neighborhood. Their families all knew each other. And so around that time, he started to notice her. And she was, even though she was 10 years younger than he was, they started to date. And they fell in love. And they wanted to get married. World War II was brewing at that time. And being the patriotic man that he was, he wanted to serve his country, you know, if he could. But he was 29 years old by then. So they decided to wait. They didn't, you know, decide not to get married yet till he found out if they needed him. He went to the recruiting office in Boston, and they looked at him and they said, well, you know, you're 29, a little old for combat. You don't have enough teeth, you know, and I think your feet are flat, you know, and all of that, you know. So they rejected him. And so he went right over to the Western Union office and he sent my mother a telegram. And he said, in the telegram it says, was rejected, let's get hitched. So he went, they did get married, and they called it going housekeeping. When that meant when a couple first got their own apartment together. So they set up housekeeping, and they were very happy newlyweds for a very short time. After they rejected him and they got married, they were living very happily. And one day he got a letter from the government that said, "Greetings, Mr. Fenner." And it was a draft notice. And they took him into the Navy once again. They really needed his experience. And so he went. And the first place they sent him, because of his diving experience, was to Pearl Harbor, because Pearl Harbor had been bombed by the Japanese. So he was there with the cleanup, you know. And after that, he was put on a destroyer escort ship, which was called the USS Aarons. And it was also a fighting ship. And he went to Europe. He was down in the Mediterranean. And some of the things that, that he experienced were horrible down there. He was there for a few months, came back to the States for 10 days. He only had 10 days to visit my mother and the family. And then they put him on a big old battleship called the USS Mississippi and sent him to the Pacific to fight the Japanese. And so, you know, it was quite a few, you know, that year was quite busy for him, you know, and quite stressful. On the ships during World War II, they weren't allowed to receive mail or send mail. And everything that went in and out of there was highly censored. So he kept this little book, and he kept it secret so nobody could see what he had written in it. And every day he would write a letter to my mother, you know, professing his love and how much he missed her. But also he wrote about the things he experienced and the places he saw. And when I read that book as an adult, because I had never read it when I was a kid, you know, but reading it as an adult, I was amazed. It was a history book, for one thing. And some of the battles he was in, and some of the casualties, and the ships that were sunk all around him, and I don't know how he survived at all. I really don't. And I guess I never appreciated that when I was young, but boy, I sure do now. When he came back from the war, of course, you know, they called us war babies, because they called us baby boomers now. But I was born in 1947, and my siblings were born in the 50s, and we were raised in the 50s and the 60s in Providence. He always had post-traumatic stress disorder, and of course, like I said, when we were children, we didn't understand, and he would fall asleep, and we would sit there and watch him because he would start to kick, and we'd say, "Come on, he's kicking, you know, and we would watch him, and then he would scream, and then you knew he was having nightmares, you know. And, you know, there was no help back then for returning combat veterans, and he lived with that all of his life. He was a very, very proud American. And in fact, he died on the 4th of July in 1993. So a true patriot, you know. The 50s and the 60s, there was a great difference between the 50s and the 60s. The 50s, we had freedom. We could roam around. We could ride our bikes anywhere. We always had a dog following behind us who was unleashed and unlicensed, and of course the dogs never bit anybody or anything, And in the 60s, things started to change. The world got a little more dangerous. We had the Vietnam War, and we had the women's movement, and we had the civil rights movement, and I lived through all of that. And between then and now, the years, leading up to now, we see that the world is more dangerous now than it was in the 60s, with all the things happening, with ISIS and all of that. And it's just, it's a scary time. You can see things instantly that happen in the world now with technology. And it's different too because the one-on-one with people is almost gone. Like I can look you in the eye right now, and I know you're looking right at me, and you're not going to grab your phone and start going like this, So you can hold somebody's attention for a little while, but then in an instant their eyes glaze over and it's gone. So that's different. It's very different. It's you can't let your kids run around anymore. You have to watch them every second. It's just a dangerous place.
How would you define the American dream?
The American dream for me, being a child of the 40s and 50s, was find a man, get married, buy a house, have a family, live in the suburbs, and live happily ever after. Women didn't have a lot of opportunities back then. Although we worked, we still had to depend on our husbands, for support. But because of all the things that happened in the 60s, all that stuff that came into play, all the women's rights and the civil rights and minorities having rights now, it's just so much better. And maybe the American dream for you, or for your generation, is still the same, is to have a family and a home. You can get an education first now, and you can work on your career now. And then maybe somewhere down the road, if you happen to meet the right person and have a family and a home, that's fine. But there's just major, major differences,
My grandmother has now been married to my Pepe, Norman Duhame, for 48 years. They had one boy, my Uncle Peter, and a set of twins, including my Aunt Carlene and my mom Charlene. She is a grandmother of 5, with the oldest being 26 and the youngest being 17.